This is what happens when you work to change things. This is what happens. First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and they fight you. I've done something in this world that has made it a little bit of a better place.
The judge just sentenced Elizabeth Holmes to 11 years, 3 months in prison.
And then all of a sudden you change the world. This is what happens. First they think you're crazy, then they fight you.
So you're paranoid. And you have to be.
Yeah. One of the most paranoid people on the planet.
She promised a revolution in a single drop of blood. Billionaires bet billions. Doctors trusted her. And then the world found out the miracle was, maybe, a lie. But this is Elizabeth Holmes, the woman who dressed like a prophet of tech. Black turtleneck, soft voice, absolute certainty, and built an empire called Theranos around one audacious promise. Accurate, dozens of tests from a finger-prick diagnostics available to everyone. It reads like a modern fairy tale. Except somewhere between the TED Talks and the glossy magazine covers, the tale fractures. Tonight, we trace that fracture, the rise, the secrecy, the whistleblowers, and the public collapse, to understand not just what happened, but how a culture can turn a promise into power, and how power can break a person. As she was young and audacious, a Stanford dropout with a pitch that sounded like science fiction, replaced drawers of lab equipment with one compact device, replace Venice drawers with a simple finger prick, replace waiting days for results with instant answers at the pharmacy. Investors saw a future where healthcare became cheap, fast, and democratized. But ambition needs witnesses, so she gathered them, board members with political clout, former generals, and senators whose names conferred legitimacy. The optics were perfect, and the story irresistible. How do you say no to a revolution packaged in charisma and clean design? Theranos' machine was simple in the telling, elegant in marketing. A small cartridge, a tiny sample of blood, a list of tests performed automatically. Imagine a device like your smartphone, but for diagnostics. It was a dream that resonated because it solved a real problem. Medical testing that was slow, expensive, and inaccessible. Yet medicine is not a marketplace of ideas. It is a domain of proof. Tests require validation, reproducibility, and transparency. The scientific method is stubborn. It demands scrutiny. Thermodynamic claims and clinical claims must survive the grind of peer review and independent verification. Theranos chose secrecy. Why keep the miracle hidden if it is, in fact, miraculous? A money-followed narrative. Silicon Valley's mythology worships founders who break rules and reshape industries. Theranos fit the archetype. Magazine covers labelled her visionary. Venture capitalists opened their checkbooks. Deals were closed with the confidence you'd expect from a person who spoke like certainty. But there's a difference between buying a product and buying a belief. When reputations are at stake, institutions, hospitals, insurers, regulatory bodies need evidence.
There are things that you can do with a single drop of blood. You can test your blood sugar level, for example. But there are other things where a single drop is just not realistic. There might not be a high enough concentration of what you're trying to measure in a tiny drop.
Studies have shown that important blood markers, such as white blood cell count or hemoglobin, can vary greatly from one drop to another when obtained via the finger. But even if individual drops were identical, certain tests need to separate out cells with a centrifuge or add specific chemicals to the samples that would make repeat testing impossible.
Not promises. And yet, for a time, the world chose to believe. How much of that belief was about the product, and how much was about who stood behind it? Inside Theranos, the atmosphere thickened. Laboratories were cloaked in non-disclosure. Employees were warned not to speak. Dissent was not tolerated. Whistleblowers would later describe a culture that prized image over interrogation, where questions were framed as disloyalty. In science, skepticism is the engine of progress. At Theranos, skepticism was a liability. How many companies have mistaken quiet for progress? How many leaders have mistaken silence for accord? And yet even shrouded the discrepancies grew. Test results that didn't match standards, equipment that was improvised, claims that were, on paper, dazzling but unverified. Then the reporting began. Investigative journalism, patient, meticulous, and relentless, followed breadcrumbs that PR had hoped to conceal. What starts as a whisper in the lab became a thread of inconsistencies, conflicting data, evasive demonstrations, and contracts that hid the truth behind legalese. A journalist asked for raw data. They asked to see the machines in operation. The answers were partial or theatrical. Demonstrations curated for investors, limited access under strict conditions. The deeper the scrutiny, the more the facade began to crumble. But when the public finally saw the evidence, the narrative flipped. The legend dissolved into scrutiny and then into scandal. Regulators, whose job is to protect patients, moved in. Clinical labs are held to standards because real lives depend on accuracy. Once tests were shown to be unreliable, partnerships dissolved, contracts ended, clinics closed. The company that guarded its secrets found itself exposed, not by a rival, but by the systems meant to ensure public safety. What followed was legal reckoning, investigations, charges, and a trial that forced the world to reckon with the distinction between ambition and fraud. For many, the shock was personal. People who trusted results, who made decisions based on those results, now had to question what they had believed. In the courtroom, narratives that once inspired turned into evidence to be dissected. A people want to explain the fall with a single word: greed, hubris, deception. But these stories are never that tidy. Ambition can be blinding. The pressure to deliver can push decisions into moral grey areas. Leaders tell themselves future success will justify present shortcuts. Was Elizabeth Holmes a calculating deceiver? Or did she, at some point, convince herself that the ends would justify the means? But whatever the answer, the result was the same. Trust was broken, and the consequences rippled far beyond a failed start. Patients, investors, employees, all paid a price. Theranos wasn't just a company, it was a mirror. It reflected a moment in our culture where mythology often outpaced method, where charisma could stand in for evidence. For investors, a reminder that due diligence must include scrutiny of data, not just pitch decks. For regulators, a call to act before harm proliferates. For society, a lesson in humility, that we must not let hope override caution when people's health is on the line. Science advances by slow, brutal iteration. Disruption is seductive. But when disruption touches lives, speed without proof is dangerous. Elizabeth Holmes' story will endure because it forces a hard conversation. How do we balance the hunger to innovate with the duty to protect? How do we reward audacity without blinding ourselves to evidence? The tale is not merely about a founder in a black turtleneck. It is about a culture that allowed the myth to grow and the systems that failed to catch it soon. Here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. Was Elizabeth Holmes a criminal who deliberately deceived the world, or a visionary undone by her own ambition? Pick one. Explain the single most convincing piece of evidence that made you choose that side. The most thoughtful answer will be pinned. If this story moved you, subscribe for more deep dives into power, ambition, and the cost of belief. We'll meet again to pull the curtain back on another empire.
Forbes magazine has downgraded the net worth of Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of a startup blood testing company, from $4.5 billion to nothing.
Breaking news on Theranos. The SEC is charging Theranos CEO Elizabeth Holmes, raising more than $700 million from investors through an elaborate years-long fraud.
The judge just sentenced Elizabeth Holmes to 11 years, 3 months in